So I think we're going to have some fun this morning, and we're going to learn some interesting things. But I think it'd be a good thing if we just welcome Mr. Jay Stailey to come up here and share his thoughts with us.
Good morning. I am aware that we're almost at the end of another season. Tom mentioned this morning that summer is ending, winding up. Lots of people will be going back to school in the next week or two, people going back to work in their jobs, and things are changing. Since I've retired from the world of education, I've decided to go have my seasons go by calendar time. So I'm holding on till September 22nd, till the end of summer. I just hold it in my grip tight and don't let go until that time. The beginning of this summer, I found myself in France. I traveled to France with a group of pilgrims. We spent 7 days at Chartres, the medieval town with the 800-year-old cathedral with the labyrinth in the floor. And that was a great experience looking at pilgrimage and sacred place. And then I spent a week in an amazing week in Paris with my wife. And we hunted out the haunts of Hemingway and Matisse and Lautrec and Jean-Paul Sartre, and that was quite an adventure. And when she came home, 15 high school kids from Houston arrived, and I met them, and we did sort of a sacred tour of France and ended up in Lyon, where on the highest point of Lyon in a UNESCO site, we built a labyrinth. And so when we left Lyon, we left that legacy behind, and it was quite an adventure. So when I came home, my daughter called me and asked me about my trip. And she asked me the question she's asked me over time a lot, because I've traveled a lot. She asked me what my favorite place was in the world. And it's a hard question. There's so many things, places I've been that have resonated with me. I've been sunrise at Machu Picchu. I've been at the Temple of the Moon in Kyoto. I've walked in the stone. The church is hewn from stone in Lalibela, Ethiopia. It's an amazing experience. But she was surprised a little bit, maybe like the boy whose sacred place was the car, when I told her that probably my favorite place in the world is 5520 Riverside Drive in Dublin, Ohio. My father and my mother were city kids. They grew up on the north side and the south side of Columbus, Ohio. And when they married, they decided they wanted to raise their family in the country. And my father had read a book called 5 Acres of Paradise, where you could buy 5 acres and live sustainably on the land. And he couldn't afford 5 acres, so he bought 3.5 acres, sort of in a subdivision adjacent to paradise, I think. And he began in this piece of cow pasture to create his little piece of paradise. The first year he was there in 46, when my oldest brother was born, he bought 5 Norwegian pine trees, live pine trees at Christmas time, and he took them around and gave them to friends and family to use as their Christmas trees. And when Christmas was over, he went around and picked those trees up, and he planted them along the driveway. We had this long gravel driveway that went to the back of the property where he built the house. And along the turnaround at the top of that driveway, he planted those 5 pine trees. And every year after that, at Christmas time, we had a live tree, and he would go out and plant that tree. So the line along the driveway grew over time. And by the time I was born in 52, there were 11 pine trees along that driveway. And by the time I was 10 years old, there were even more. By the time I was 6 years old, in 58, when I started off to school, my first day of school, first grade, I can remember walking down the driveway with my brothers and feeling the comfort of that tunnel of trees, because the trees had grown up on one side of the driveway, those pine trees, and on the other side there was a ditch, a fence line, and the hardwoods had grown up there. There were elm trees and oak trees and buckeye trees, and the trees kind of came together above us. So we had this long tunnel of trees. And in the summertime, the temperature in that tunnel of trees was about 15 degrees cooler than it was outside. And in the wintertime, we could walk down that tunnel, and we were protected from the winter winds. When we came out of the tunnel, the temperature seemed to drop, and the wind chill came up from the winter winds. So that tunnel of trees for many years felt really safe to me, really safe. And one summer, I think I must have been about 10 years old, we had new neighbors down front. We called it down front. It was a 5-acre plot, and another family had bought and built on the front 2 acres of this piece of land. And these new neighbors, the Coleys, had called my mom and invited my brothers and I to come down and visit with them. She had a cousin visiting from Montana, and he was a working cowboy. And she thought it'd be fun for the 3 boys, the Stailey boys, to come and visit with her cousin. So as the sun set, we walked down through that tunnel of trees and out the driveway and on down the hill until we got to the Coley's house. And she had said she would have dessert for us. Well, she did have dessert for us. In my house, my mother grew up with 7 brothers and sisters during the Depression. And it was a time when portions were small. And my mother never gave that up. Our portions were always small. When my mother made brownies, she would cut the brownies into little bitty squares about that big. And we could have one. We could have one brownie for dessert. And when we got to the Coley's house that night, Miss Coley had these big bowls. And she had cut brownies, and literally the brownies fit in the bottom of those bowls, these huge square brownies. And on top, a dip of ice cream, a scoop of ice cream on top. It was the most amazing thing I'd ever held in my life, I think. It was tremendous. And then we went with those brownies into the living room. In our house, you never took food anywhere out of the kitchen. But they let us take those brownies into the living room. So there we sat in the living room with our bowls and our brownies and our ice cream, listening to this cowboy tell his stories about Montana. It was a magical moment for a kid in central Ohio, I'll tell you. And he told stories about his work, and then he had a guitar, and he began to sing songs, and he sang some cowboy songs. He sang this haunting song about, they call the wind Mariah. You remember that song maybe? And then he sang that one about, and boy, I wasn't concentrating on my brownie at that point. I was getting a little spooked out. And then he, yippee-ki-yay, ghost riders in the sky. And my brother bumped me and pointed at my ice cream. It was melting down over my brownie. So I started up again. And then he told us a story about a man he knew that had been walking in the woods in Montana, and he turned on the path, and there was a grizzly bear in the middle of the path and was protecting her cub. And that, before the man knew what had happened, that grizzly bear had taken his paw and swung it, and with a sharp claw had just sliced his arm right off his body. And he watched his arm fall to the ground. My eyes were so big. And my brownie was still pretty big too. I wasn't thinking about eating. And after he told that story, he told a story about another fella he knew that was in his pickup truck, and the pickup truck ran out of gas outside of town, and he looked off at the lights of town, and he got out of his truck, and he started walking to town, and pretty soon there were lights above his head, and he looked up, and there was a UFO up there, and it lifted him up into the spaceship. And they did all these things with probes and weird stuff. And then when he went into town, finally got into town, and he told this story, no one believed him. But they brought in a lie detector machine, and they ran him through that lie detector machine. And the machine had said it was all true. He believed every bit of it was true. And my eyes were huge. And my brownie was huge. And the only thing that brought me kind of back to the moment was the telephone ringing in the kitchen. And I could hear Miss Coley answer the phone and say, okay, hold on. And she called for my brother Josh, and my brother Josh went to the phone, and I could hear him say, okay, yeah, all right, I'll send him home. And he hung up the phone. And he came into the living room and he said, Jay, that was Mom. It's your bedtime. It's time for you to go home. She said to send you home. And I said, me? He said, yeah, Jay, yeah, it's time to go home. I said, just by myself go home? And my brother looked at me kind of funny. He said, yeah, it's time to go home. So I thanked Miss Coley. I took my uneaten brownie to the kitchen counter and put it on the counter. And I said goodnight and thank you and went to the door and went outside. And I had my back up against the door, and there was a light on the wall. You know those kind of half lights that are up against the wall? And it cast this half circle of light out into the darkness. And I went out there into the edge of the light, and I looked out. It was dark. It was really, really dark out there. And I backed back up to the wall, and then I thought about going back in, but I knew I couldn't face my brothers and tell them I was scared. You know, some things you don't tell your brothers. So I went out to the edge of the light, and I took a deep breath, and I just broke out running. And when I hit the driveway, that gravel driveway, I could hear the gravel pinging out from underneath my tennis shoes as I raced up that driveway. And I got right up to the entrance of that tunnel of trees. And I smelled something I had never smelled before in Central Ohio. I smelled bears. I smelled bear. The smell of bears was coming out of that tunnel of trees, and I thought, I don't want to go in there. And so I went out into the field, and I started to run up the field towards the house. I could see the lights of the house way up there. But then I began to realize that a person running out in the middle of a field like that would be susceptible to a UFO coming down. And I got frightened. I went back towards the tunnel of trees, and as I headed into the tunnel, I could smell the bears, and I went back out into the field, and I could look for lights. So I finally decided on a path that was right next to the trees, that if the bears came out, I could move away, and if the UFOs came down, I could hide in the tunnel. And I made it all the way up to the house, and I got to the front door, and I knocked on the front door, and my mother came to the front door, and she could see the fear in my eyes. She could see it. She said, Jay, are you okay? I said, yeah, Mom, I'm okay. She said, well, it's time for bed. Go on to bed. And I went out into the bedroom and lay out there by myself in the darkness, and I could hear sticks cracking outside, you know. So I knew the bears were close. I'd never heard them before, but I knew they were close to the windows. But I was inside, and I was safe, and it felt good. And my daughter, she's been to 5520 Riverside Drive, and she understood why that could be one of my favorite places. But then I said to her, you know, there's another place. And she said, what place is that? And I said, Clear Lake Shores. She knows Clear Lake Shores because Clear Lake Shores is where she grew up. It's where she had her childhood. It's a little island that's in North Galveston County. Some of you may know Kemah area in Harris County, Galveston County. And it's right in between the bay, Galveston Bay, and Clear Lake, this little island. We lived there. When we returned from South America in 81, we bought a house there, and we raised our kids there, lived there for 25 years on the island. And I loved the island because it was close to the water, and it was contained. You always felt like you could leave your problems at the end of the day on the mainland and cross that bridge. They'd be waiting for you the next morning when you went off, but you could kind of leave them on the mainland and get out on the island. And another reason I really love the island, there were a lot of characters that lived on the island, and I love to hear their stories and tell their stories. So this is one of those stories. How am I doing? Am I doing all right? I keep looking at the clock, but I forgot to look at it when I started. So what good is it? Right? Kairos time. It's Kairos time. Tommy Chapman moved onto the island of Clear Lake Shores after the big war. This is the story they tell. And Tommy was kind of an unremarkable man. He bought a little cottage down on Grove Street. He took his last paycheck from the Army, and he bought a stake bed truck. And he parked it behind his house, kept it parked there. And he went into the business of hauling. He would haul stuff for people. Anything anyone was willing to pay him to haul, he would haul. He hauled pipe, and he hauled steel, and he hauled wood. He hauled dirt and manure, and sometimes he'd clean the bed up and haul people's belongings if they needed to move. Anything anyone would pay him to haul, that was his business. And when he wasn't hauling things, he was either sitting out on his front porch whittling, he liked to whittle, or he'd sit in the kitchen with some of the other vets that had come back from the war, and they would play Moon and 42 and sit and talk there in his house. And it was an unremarkable house, just like Tommy, except for one fact. Tommy had a print of the paintings of Paul Gauguin, at least one in every room. And none of them were those Paris times, Gauguin's times in Paris with the Impressionists, Post-Impressionists. Most of those prints, all those prints really in his house, were the ones that Gauguin had painted in the Tahitian islands sort of at the end of his life. Those beautiful paintings of beaches and raven-haired, beautiful brown-skinned women on the beaches, the forest behind and the blue sea in front. And so when people asked him what it was, why he had those paintings, he answered in his typical unremarkable way, I just like that place, is what he said. And people would shrug their shoulders. Tommy was one of those people that never spoke much, but unlike people that sometimes there's people that don't speak very often, but when they do, everyone pays attention. That wasn't Tommy, because really no one paid attention to him when he talked, because he really didn't have much remarkable to say. So he worked there in his hauling business for a number of years, and finally his truck hit about 200,000 miles, and the front end gave out on his truck. And he had it towed into his backyard with every intention of getting the front end fixed. Tommy was unremarkable, but not stupid. He knew what the road to hell is paved with. And the birds came and built nests in the truck, in the cab. And when the birds left, the hornets came. And pretty soon the kudzu and the trumpet vines were growing up over that truck. And it just became this huge green mound in his backyard. And he pulled the winch off of it and a few other tools, and he sold them. And he got enough money. He bought some lumber, some used lumber, and some used corrugated tin. And he built a shed on the side of his house. He put up a sign that said Tommy's Fix-It Shop and bicycle repair, I think it said. Fix-It Shop and bicycle repair. And then he did the same thing that he did with hauling stuff. Anything anybody would bring to him that was broken, he'd try to fix it. And if he fixed it, they'd pay him for it. And more often than not, he was pretty successful. He was good with his hands. He hung around in his house a lot more, played a lot more dominoes. And he lived that little unremarkable life there on our island for a time, until one morning he woke up. He'd had a dream. He'd had a dream that if he went to Austin, Texas, he would hear some amazing news. And he thought about it while he drank his coffee in the morning, but people came around with stuff he needed to work on, and pretty soon the dream had just escaped him, had left his mind. Until about a week later, when he had the same dream. If he went to Austin, Texas, if he stood on the steps of the Capitol building, he would hear some amazing news. And all day long he thought about it, but by nightfall he kind of put that dream aside. Until a week later, when the third time he had that same dream. And the next morning he woke up talking to himself. He said, I've never been to Austin. I could just go, see what it's like. Wouldn't hurt anything. So by middle of the morning, he'd hitched a ride into League City, got in a bus into Houston, took the Greyhound, got a round-trip ticket, took the Greyhound up to Austin. And by mid-afternoon, he was standing on the steps of the Capitol building, just waiting for amazing news. And the legislature was in session. There were politicians, senators, congresspeople running up and down the steps, being chased by their staff or led by their staff. And he listened carefully, but he didn't hear anything. And he came back the next day, and he stood there again on the steps, and he listened all day long. All this bustle around him, and he didn't hear any amazing news. And he thought, I should probably go home. This is ridiculous. But he came back the next day. And in the middle of the afternoon, he was standing on the steps, and some Peckerwood state senator from East Texas came out of the Capitol to rub elbows with the little people, I think. And he saw Tommy. He came over and he clapped him on the back, how you do? asked Tommy what he was doing there. What brings you to Austin, the great capital of the great state of Texas? And, Tommy was kind of embarrassed for himself and the senator. And he mumbled this story about the dream. And the senator looked at him like he was a complete idiot, looked down his nose at him and said, "You've got to be kidding me. We don't have time in this world to go chasing after dreams." You know, it's a good thing there are people in this world that feel some responsibility to their work. Otherwise, I wouldn't be here doing the business of the people. I had a dream, and if I followed that dream, I'd be down on some mosquito-infested island on the shore of Galveston Bay. I would be looking for Jean Lafitte's treasure underneath the front axle of some truck in some guy's yard named Chapman. I don't have time for that kind of nonsense. Go home. He told Tommy, go home. And he turned around and worried that maybe some of what he wanted, what the little people have might rub off on him. He ran back into the Capitol building. Tommy turned around, walked down the steps, got out his Greyhound ticket, and came back to Clear Lake Shores. And that night, he slept in his little house on Grove Street amongst his go-gons. That's what he called them, my go-gons. And he had a dreamless sleep. And the next morning, he got up and went out to the shed and pulled down a machete from the wall. And he got in the backyard and he started hacking away at that mountain of green in his backyard that was the former business partner that he had. And he got in underneath there and he began to bring out dirt like a troll in his mountain domain. He was digging down in there, bringing out dirt. And he filled up the cab with dirt, and he filled out the running boards with dirt. And he had a bunch of these wringer washing machines. He was really good at fixing these wringer washing machines. And he started filling them up with dirt. And the third day, after he had come home, somebody went by the shop to see. He had a toaster that was only cooking bread on one side, you know, and he wanted Tommy to take a look at it. And so he went in, and the house was open. The go-gons were all hanging in there. The shed was open. The shop was open, but there was no Tommy anywhere. And he thought he was probably in League City getting some parts for something, so he said he'd come back later. And later that afternoon, one of Captain Oakey's kids came by, one of the Owens boys, and he had a bent rim from his bicycle, hoping Tommy could fix it up for him. But Tommy wasn't there. He looked all over, couldn't find him anywhere. And in fact, they never found Tommy anywhere. He never came back to that house. That house sat empty with those go-gons in there hanging on the wall. And no one heard from Tommy for years and years and years. And in 1957, I think it's 57 or 58, at the 4th of July picnic at Depot Park, Captain Oakey was walking around with a postcard showing it to people. And on the front of the postcard, there was a woman with dark hair sitting on a beach, beautiful green jungle behind her, this lovely blue sea in front of her. And when you turned the postcard over, it said, "I really like this place." And it was signed Tommy Chapman. And that's the story of the unremarkable dreams of Tommy Chapman. I've begun looking a lot more at this role that place plays in our narrative and why it's important. Sometimes place is the setting in our stories, but sometimes place is the hero of our stories or the destination of our stories. So I encourage you to think about your narrative and the role that places play in that, because we need those places that resonate with us, those places that fill our soul, those places that help us walk in the world as stronger, better people. Thank you.